Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and once again, I'm joined by Forbidden Planet's mighty head book buyer, Laura Jane Dodd. How you doing, Dodd?
Yeah, no, very well, thank you. How are you, Andrew?
I am very well, thanks, mate. And we have been looking forward to this conversation because
Certainly have.
on today's episode, we're welcoming the one and only super author, Gwendolyn Kiste. How are you, mate?
Just fine. Very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's so lovely to have you on, joining us, as we were talking about off camera, from your abandoned horse farm somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic.
It's true. Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons we asked you to join us today is that Laura is a massive fan of your work. So I'll let Laura run with that intro for a second.
Okay, so we're here obviously to talk about Reluctant Immortals, your kind of latest book, and I believe your first one with Titan.
Yes.
So hopefully there will be more.
And we're very, very proud to have you on board, by the way, Gwendolyn. We really are very pleased.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I've been a fan of Titan books for years, so this has just been such a joy. This is so wonderful.
Fantastic. That's lovely.
Brilliant. So your newest book kind of centers around women in kind of classical fictional kind of horror literature. So what made you pick your two main characters, Lucy and Bee?
Yeah, so I've been a fan of Gothic literature since I was a little kid. You know, my dad's very into horror, and so I mean, I was introduced to Dracula. So it's Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre. Those are the two main characters in Reluctant Immortals. And so like Dracula, I feel like, you know, I've known since I was very young because I saw the Universal film when I was probably like 4 or 5. And then when I was a little bit older, I saw the Orson Welles, Joan Fontaine version of Jane Eyre with my dad. And it was just like, I thought about how both of them were just so Gothic and they've just kind of stuck in my head for all these years. And I always felt like Lucy and Bertha deserved better. And so then I was like, you know what? Like I'd written a couple of short stories with each of them as like characters. And I thought, you know, it'd be really interesting to get these two characters together and see what they think about Edward Rochester and Dracula. And so really that was just the start of the book and just going from there.
How fascinating that you were absolutely had such a deep dive into Gothic cinema. I almost say Gotham City cinema, Gothic cinema when you were so young. I mean, encountering Bela Lugosi and Orson Welles as Rochester, and he's marvelous as Rochester, I think, at that age, that must have been a kind of indelible experience.
It was very fun. Like I've always loved horror, and it's, you know, I've always loved that kind of like jolt of horror and being kind of like creeped out by it, but also fascinated. But, you know, especially like the Dracula movies, there's so many different ones. I'm a huge fan of the Hammer films, and like they're so different than the Universal version, but they're all so much fun, and they're creepy, but they're also campy. And I love that too. Like some people are like, no, I don't like campy horror. I'm like, I love it. I love the idea that you can be kind of afraid, but also like this is kind of silly and kitschy and fun. So I love that combination. And I think those classic horror movies really have that, so it's so much fun.
I think that's very well said. The great thing about the Hammer movies, they have that kind of breathless pacing to them, and that heightened, almost kind of pantomime acting from Lee and those guys. They're just so good, and Cushing, you know, amazing.
Yeah. So they quite interestingly, so you touched upon there about kind of covering those characters before in kind of short stories or other works. So I know a little bit about 8 People Who Murdered Me, which was obviously featured Lucy. So have you kind of had an attachment to Lucy for a while?
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel like that really started when I was pretty young when I saw then the Francis Ford Coppola version of Dracula, and I loved Sadie Frost in it so much. And I wanted just a whole movie about her. She was my favorite character in it, even though I love Winona Ryder, but like I loved Sadie Frost's version of Lucy so much more. And so when she dies in it, I remember being a little kid, I was probably like 9 or 10 when I saw it, and I was like, oh, that's so sad. Like I knew she was going to die, I knew the story, but I was like so sad. And so it's like ever since then, like I've thought a lot about Lucy and gone back to read the book, and I'm always like, oh, poor Lucy. And so it was just like, I want to hang out with Lucy. I want to know what's going on with her. I want to see things from her side.
I think she's an inspired choice. And by the way, this is completely off topic, but I don't know if I've ever told you this, Dodd. Sadie Frost once shared a cigarette with me at the Q Awards about 15 years ago. even though I don't smoke. yeah, but she was super friendly, and she loves the that's one of her favorite performances. It's one of my favorite performances of hers. So yeah, what a great reference point.
Yes, I love that. That makes me so happy. Yay.
And it's one of those films, I still watch it probably every year or so, and it still kind of stands up as being a really kind of good adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
It really is, you know, in terms of like having all of the characters, all of Lucy's suitors, for example, a lot of times in the film versions, they like combine some of them. You don't get Seward or you don't get Quincy. Mm-hmm. And so it's like they have all of them and they're all developed characters. So that's a very different, you know, I mean, it is closer to the book in a lot of ways than most of the adaptations. Mm-hmm. So that's really a great thing. And the set design and production design on it is just some of the best. Like, yes, it's a little bit campy. I think Coppola knew that let's go with like how they look a little bit campy, and yet it's beautiful and it's so gothic. So yeah, that's really wonderful.
I think that's so true, and it's such a beautiful adaptation, bringing to screen of the epistolary nature of the novel. I think it's it's the only adaptation to really portray that element of it on screen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's lovely. Yeah. Yeah, and English Keanu Reeves, don't get any better than that.
Yeah, Keanu Reeves just does Keanu Reeves, basically.
Correct. Yeah, English Keanu Reeves, American Keanu.
So, kind of touching on the kind of, I suppose, the kitsch there. So, is that why you kind of picked the kind of 1960s Hollywood setting? Because there is like a kind of kitschy appeal to that as well.
Yeah, that was something I was really thinking about. You know, that's also sort of the era. Some of the Hammer's films obviously started in the 50s, but, you know, the 60s, they were definitely still making a lot of those classic Hammer films. So I was thinking about that. And then again, yeah, there's a lot of kitsch to the 1960s. And so kind of combining that with that, you know, hyper realistic or almost fantastical version of what San Francisco was like at that time, and also what LA was like at that time. It was interesting going as I was researching, like, you know, LA was in kind of this state of disrepair and the Hollywood sign was literally falling down at that point. So it was like everything felt so gothic. So it was like, this is a really interesting place to set a gothic book, and it would, you know, there are a lot of elements of the gothic in Los Angeles and San Francisco at that time. So it's like, okay, let's do this. Let's see how these Victorian heroines are in 1960s California.
I think it's fantastic. You know, I'm certain that, you know, Rust Maidens, for example, must have been some kind of dark arcane force back in the day when he was making his films, because it's the only thing that explains why they are the way they are. You know what I mean?
I love that.
What do you think of the cover design of the Titan edition?
I love it. Yeah, I think it's absolutely beautiful. A lot of people have described it as like a horror version of Almost Famous, that great cover from the Cameron Crowe movie. And I love that movie. So people like describing it like that. I'm like, I just think it's beautiful. I'm super happy.
Yeah, it's a I like the American cover as well, but it's definitely a different vibe.
Yeah, and that makes me so happy, because I can see how the people who create, like, each of the artists got to the different covers, and they are very different, but I'm like, yeah, both of those covers fit the book, and that's been really fun to see. I'm like, they're very different, but I'm like, yeah, both of those work for the so well, and I love them both. I think they're both so beautiful. So yeah.
And there's within the book, there's obviously kind of lots of references and kind of Easter eggs to the kind of original classics. So did you have time to kind of reread those in preparation for writing this, and has your opinions kind of changed over the years of those classics?
Oh, that's a great question. And I did go back and reread these sections. In particular, I really spent a lot of time with the sections about Lucy and about Bertha, and really focusing on, you know, what I could take, and like you said, the Easter eggs, and kind of having a lot of references to that material. I also watched a lot of the film versions of both Jane Eyre and Dracula, especially since there is such, you know, a nod to the film versions in the book. So I went back to those. In terms of my opinion changing, I like that. I think with Jane Eyre, I obviously love both of these books, but it's funny because when I first saw Jane Eyre when I was young, I'm like, oh, it's so romantic. And then as I've gotten older, I'm like, it's pretty dark and scary. So it's like, you know, I always laugh because it's like, There's still a part of me that I think, because I loved it and thought it was romantic when I was young, I still do. But then there's the other part of me that's like, no, this is terrifying and so gothic. But there's almost like, it's almost fun having those two kind of like conflicting ideas, because it's like the characters in the book almost feel that way at times. So I'm like, that works. But yeah, I do think as I've gotten older, Jane Eyre has become scarier to me, you know?
I think that's very, very true. I think it's got a similar, it's like the energy from a completely different book, Wuthering Heights. I think the older you get and the more perspective you have on it, that you realize that obsession-based narrative, it's quite disturbing, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Like, I think both of those, you know, both Brontes, they're really great in that regard. Like, you see that you come to them when you're younger, and then as you get older, like you said, the perspective, you're like, have a little bit of a different opinion now. This is a bit scarier.
And with the with the kind of two characters, so would there be any other kind of classic characters that you would like to kind of write a modern version of?
Yeah, I would love to do something with Dorian Gray, and in particular his first girlfriend, Sybil Vane. I actually originally wanted Reluctant Immortals to be Jane Eyre, Dracula, and Dorian Gray, and it would have been the three women.
Okay.
You know, I talked with my editor, and he's like, if you want to do that, it's going to have to be a much bigger book. And he was so right. And I knew I wanted it to be about the length that it was. And once we got into it, and, you know, once I really, really started crafting the first draft, I'm like, yeah, there wasn't enough room to do all three of them, but I would still love to do something from Sybil Vane's perspective and Dorian Gray. Like, I think that would be really fun. I think that would be really interesting.
Ooh, yeah, definitely. At least kind of, well, maybe a sneak peek to a future novel, right?
Yeah.
Me and Andrew were talking before about obviously the kind of resurgence of horror, which is obviously great news for us and for where we work, because obviously we're huge kind of just love a good scare. So with things like Cabinet of Curiosities on the TV, Dark Pictures anthology, Silent Hill coming back next year, the sheer kind of diversity of the offer now. So why do you think it kind of endures? And what was your kind of first experience of horror?
You know, part of the reason I feel like it endures so much is because the world is scary and life is scary. So I feel like it gives us that outlet of like, you know, here's a place we can explore those fears. It's safer than, you know, having to deal with it in day-to-day life. You know, and like I said, my dad was really into horror when I was growing up. So it's like, you know, my parents got married on Halloween. And so it was like, everything was always very kind of creepy. And it was always like, you know, Halloween was a big deal in our house, you know, and just really growing up with that as kind of the background of my life. So yeah, it's very, I love horror, and it's always like, it's comforting. There's nostalgia to it. I think for many of us who did grow up with it, you know, it's so much fun, and it's creepy and it's scary, but it can bring that comfort of being able to say, hey, this is a way of dealing with the terror in the world, because there's always a lot of it, right? Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we're waist deep in existential dread these days, right? And I know that I am. You know, I like frequently wake up screaming in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, except the reasons are all around us, you know.
Oh, that's so sad, but yes, the reasons are all around us. I like that. That's a great line. It's so true.
You know, I'm happy on the outside. I'm just crying on the inside, as we all no doubt. I mean, turn the news on and it's a reason to be miserable. So I think tapping in, I think what you do, and we were talking about, Dodd and I were talking before this began about the pace of your writing and what a spectacular read that your work is. If people are turned on by this book, what would you recommend from the books you published thus far that they dig into next? And before you answer that question, I've got to like put my hand in the air and say that I absolutely love, as does my daughter, your short story collection and her Smile Will Untether the Universe, which I think, by the way, is such a fantastic title for a short story and a short story collection.
Oh, thank you so much. That makes me so happy to hear. It's funny, I actually was going to say the collection. That's like, I have a real soft spot because it's like, that was my first book. And so it's like, you know, that was like that, you come into it and it's like, you're so like starry-eyed being like, my first book. So there's like something so about it. And I love short fiction. You know, that was what I first started reading as a horror fan before I started reading horror novels. So I love horror short fiction. So yeah, I would say Enter, Smile, Untether the Universe, my collection, or my first novel, The Rust Maidens. I feel like that one is one that a lot of people seem to like. I'm always like, thank you, everyone. You never know when you put a book out in the world, you have no idea how people are going to react, but a lot of people seem to like that one. So that's a good one.
And you've had a multi-award-winning career in a short space of time, haven't you? Is it 3 Bram Stoker Awards? Is that right?
Yes.
How does that feel?
Still surreal. It's still something, because like you said, it's not like a long period of time. I won the first one, I think, in 2019. So it's only been like a little over 3 years to win 3 awards that are like, I've known the Bram Stoker Awards since I was a teenager. So it's like really, yeah, that's a surreal. That's the best thing I can say. It's a very surreal thing.
It's obviously the only way is up from here. So more awards, right? So just to because I'm really kind of fascinated about in the book, so the idea of kind of seeing the decay from Lucy in the rooms that she goes into, and then also kind of the weird force inside B, without kind of spoiling it too much for people watching this. So where did you come up with those ideas, because they're just fascinating to read?
Yeah, so with the vampires in Reluctant Immortals, they actually bring decay with them. And so I always thought it was interesting that when you watch vampire films or you read vampire stories, there's always decay everywhere. And the idea I always assumed was, it's just because they're old and like, who wants to clean every day, right? Like, I mean, if you're immortal, who wants to be cleaning every single day? So I always assumed that was, the idea. But then I thought, what if like the vampires, because they're dead, decay just attracts to them? And so that's what I play with in Reluctant Immortals, this idea that, Lucy and B live in this old Hollywood mansion, but it's decaying really fast around them. Like the wallpaper is peeling and dust is everywhere and cobwebs. It's like every day they have to kind of fight against this sort of decay and entropy that Lucy is attracting. And there's a similar thing going on. Again, I don't want to spoil it because it doesn't actually come up and you don't find out about about a third of the way through the book, but with Jayne and Rochester and Bertha, who goes by B in Reluctant Immortals, there's a force inside of them that also is kind of bringing in, its own form of decay. And, I always think immortality would be terrible. I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, I want to live forever. I'm like, that sounds terrible. Do for that long. That's like one of the things I explore in this. Like, they don't ever have any money, because it's like, it's hard to keep money going for like decades and decades. And so, I really wanted to explore that kind of decay that I think would attract, if you were immortal. Like, decay is going to be all around you. Everybody is going to die unless they're immortal too. And so that was really something I was thinking about and trying to make that kind of more literal as I was writing the book.
Yeah, so kind of, I suppose the overall theme of like the kind of ode to forgotten women and kind of women in literature who quite often, I think, kind of played second fiddle to the main characters. So was that a kind of conscious decision of yours, and to kind of give them a voice?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I've been such a fan of both Bertha and Lucy and always wanting to know more about them, and just being able to write this book and being like, let's have this from their perspective. Let's have them talk about, what it's like to, like you said, be second fiddle, be this kind of footnote in someone else's story, and how that would affect them, and how, there's a lot of rage there. There's a lot of anger. There's hurt from that of no longer being able to kind of own your own narrative, and having them, work throughout the book to try to reclaim that. So yeah, absolutely. That was a big thing that I was definitely thinking about as I was writing it.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very interesting, because although one of some of the DNA is indeed like a female author, a lot of the kind of characters at the forefront of your novel are often marginalized, by male characters, by the actions of men, and I think exploring that's very interesting.
Yeah, and anytime I've ever read anything that's kind of reclaimed it from that perspective, like other types of literature, and really kind of bringing those side characters to the forefront. I always find it so interesting. And I always am like, yeah, like I want to hear it from other people's perspectives, especially stories like Dracula and Jane Eyre that, have been adapted so many times, both in books and in films and on stage and in ballets and like every form that you can think of. And so it's like, rather than just bringing it and just doing a kind of more conventional retelling, kind of taking it from that different direction and saying, what shakes out there? How does the story look different from a different perspective?
That's very interesting. Dodd, over to you.
Yes, yeah. So I'm always kind of fascinated as well about kind of, I suppose, what you're kind of reading to inform what you're writing. So what would you consider to be your kind of favorite underrated horror book that all of us should go and immediately try and find?
Wow, underrated horror book. Because when you said favorite, I always go with We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. But I feel like it's been really reclaimed over the last 10 years. I think even 10 years ago, I could have said that as being an underrated classic, but it's really had a resurgence, which is great. But now I can't use it for any underrated horror classics because I think it's rated pretty highly now. Wow, let me think. I know there's like some great stuff out there that I don't feel like gets enough attention. I always say for people to read the work of Sarah Tantlinger and Krista Carmen. They both have, Sarah is primarily an editor and poetry, she's a poet. So her poetry collection, so honestly, she's had several. So really any of them, like Love for Slaughter, she's had a number of them. So really anything with her or anything she's edited, I feel like could get more attention. So I will go with that. Like her most recent work that she's edited is called Chromophobia. And it's a women in horror anthology that focuses on horror and color. So kind of like, it's like something like the yellow wallpaper, something that really brings color into it. And so that's just fascinating. I love when you have these anthologies with themes that I never would have thought of, but then you're like, ooh, I wonder what everybody did with that. So yeah, so we'll go with that. I'd like to see that get more attention.
Yeah, that's a great concept and another wonderful title, Chromophobia. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, that really lands. With regard to your background in film, what would you rate as your top 5 horror movies?
Ooh, top 5 horror movies. Oh, that's hard. Oh wow. Let's see, what am I feeling right now? Because I think everybody's favorites kind of shift over time.
So true.
So
yeah.
We're talking about Dracula, so I've got to go with Horror of Dracula, the first, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. That's my favorite Dracula. I love it. Like there's so many good Draculas, but that's my favorite. I remember my dad, it was like on Saturday morning TV and him like calling me into the room, kid. He would always call me kid, come in here, kid. He still does call me kid. I act like he doesn't anymore. I'm like 38 years old. I'm still called kid. But, and like I got to watch the first scene I ever saw of that was the end scene with like
the candelabra
and the curtain and everything. And I'm like, oh, what is this? Like it was, that was my first exposure to Hammer movies. And so it's like, I've been hooked for life since then. So we'll go with that. Let's see, what are some other ones that I really love? I'm gonna go with Texas Chainsaw Massacre because it scared me so much as a teenager. Like most horror films didn't really scare me, but that one I'm like, oh, that is no. And at the time I was kind of scared of the country, right? And now I live in the country, so that's kind of funny. Like at the time I like lived in like a little small town, did not go to the country. So the thought of like this rural area was very scary. And now I live in a rural area, so it's like okay, so that one's good. I keep thinking The Wicker Man, probably because of Christopher Lee, even though like, I'm like, it's very anti-witch. It's a very anti-witch movie, but it's still, I still, there's a lot of love there. Because again, it's very campy. It's very silly and very campy and wonderful in that regard.
It's a really big Christopher Lee performance as well, isn't it? In the sense that, I mean, in Horror of Dracula, his performance as Dracula is impeccable, but as the Hammer films go on, he becomes more and more pared down in one note. And when you see him as Lord Summerisle, it's like an explosion of theatricality.
It is, and I love how he doesn't come into it till like almost halfway through, and it's like this, then he shows up. And I remember the first time I was watching, of course I knew he was going to be in it, but like you're caught up in the rest of the story. And then all of a sudden he shows up, like, oh, there he is. In his sneakers, right? Which I was like, this doesn't seem right. Like, why is Dracula wearing sneakers? And that like totally threw me, and I loved that so much about it. Let's go with The Babadook. I love The Babadook. I think that's such a great one. And I don't always watch like movies as they come out. So a lot of times I'm very far behind, but watching that one, I felt like it deserved all the hype that it got. It's such a great, it's such a great depiction of grief and motherhood and so much. And it's just very creepy. And I love the little book. Like I almost want that book, but then I don't, because I don't want the Babadook to come around. I'm good. No Babadook here. And I think that was 4. So 5, let's do Carrie from Brian De Palma. I think that it is such a beautifully made movie. I think you can almost like stop any scene and look at the still of it, and it's just a beautifully made movie. So I just love it. I love some of the technical aspects of it, and then I love the performances, and it's just, yeah, love that one since I was a teenager too.
These are fantastic choices, absolutely brilliant. Yeah. So Gwendolyn, we're racing towards the end of our time together, and that being the case, Dodd, do you have some questions for us to close out on?
Yes. So I was just going to ask as well quickly, have you seen Terrifier yet?
No, I don't think so. No.
My God, it's fairly recent, and then the second one has just come out, but it's kind of one of those horror films when when you think you've seen everything and you haven't, and then you watch that and then you're just like, okay. It's definitely worth watching, and it has the scariest ass clown you will ever meet. So
okay, all right, I'm intrigued. I'm gonna have to look this up. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Oh my God, it's intense.
Scary clowns terrify me, so I won't be watching that.
Oh,
I'd love to hear you guys talk about it.
So to finish up, so 2 questions. So what's your kind of most cherished possession, and what are you working on next?
Most cherished possession, wow. I don't actually know. Like, I'm trying to think. Honestly, probably, like, this is probably almost silly, but like if I had to pick a cherished possession, it would probably be like my little like cat named Lester from childhood. He's like this little pound curry. Like, I keep him where I can always see him. Because I was just thinking like cherished possession, like, well, what would I grab out of the house if it was I'm like Lester, he's even where I know where he is. Like, I would grab my husband, my cats, and my fake cat Lester, and that would be it. Like, he was like my best friend when I was like 4 years old. So definitely Lester. Like, there needs to be more like creepy horror toy stories, because like, so many people have like favorite toys when they're kids, but that can be kind of weird and creepy too. So I need to write a short story about creepy horror toys. And as for what I'm working on next, finishing up my next novel. It's about a haunted neighborhood, and also working on a lot of short fiction. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. Yeah.
That is amazing, and I like the way that you are suitably discreet about your next project, and whatever that may be, we'd love you to have you back on and talk about that as well.
Yeah. I'd love to. That'd be wonderful. Yes.
And thanks for joining us to talk about Reluctant Immortals, which we're very, very pleased to be associated with at Titan and supporting at Forbidden Planet. And we're very excited about the book.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.